In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Please be seated. Good morning. What a pleasant gospel. Gosh, horrific. A horrible, horrible gospel. It is, but it's probably it's probably one of the most significant parts of the gospel story, in as much as it's been captured in literature and art, and even in opera. Of course, the opera Salome. It's an extraordinary story, really, and it's a powerful story. I think the message today, as it relates to both Amos and this gospel from Mark, this reading from Mark, is it reminds us that the prophetic voice, the voice of the prophet, is a voice of truth that always speaks to power or challenges power in a way that can be quite unsettling for these folks in powerful positions. We see it in Amos this morning in the Old Testament, and certainly John, when John speaks his truth to Herod, this is, by the way, one of the sons, Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. And he is now king or tetrarch. And so when Herod speaks his truth to him about his relationship with his wife Herodias, who was, by the way, married to Herod's brother, Herod says this, when John says to Herod, this isn't a good thing, what you realize right away is John's not concerned about the consequences. Prophets are not concerned about the consequences. The prophetic voice doesn't care about what it may cost that person or that voice. The prophetic voice speaks truth to power. And so that's why John's in prison. It's clear that Herod likes him. Herod likes John. Herod knows what he's done. Herod knows that he is a sinner. In many ways. And so he likes keeping John around. He likes hearing that voice. He respects John's message. And I think more than anything, he fears it, because he knows in his heart of hearts that John is from God. And so this is a tragic story this morning, in the sense that it sort of gets away from Herod. What he does is, of course, as you read the story, he offers anything to this daughter of Herodias, and she ends up being manipulated by her mother, because her mother can't stand John, because John talked about how bad they were together, right? So once the daughter says, "Mom, he'll give me anything we want," the wife takes advantage of that and says, "I want the life of John the Baptist." And that's exactly what happens. Well, it didn't have to happen in that moment, and that's where I was this week. I kept finding myself standing in that moment of decision for Herod. What an extraordinary moment for Herod, when the daughter comes and says, "I want the head of John the Baptist." That was the worst thing in the world you could have asked for Herod. He would have given up half. He even says, "I'll give you half of my land." But never in his wildest dreams did he think that his daughter conspiring with his wife would put him in such a position. He's standing in that place between truth and power. And it's a moment, it can be a moment of extraordinary grace. He has the power in that moment to redeem the situation, to save a man's life. But he is so bound up and so held by power. He so much more celebrates his position, his privilege, that all he can think about is, if I don't honor her request, I'm going to lose my status or my power with these guests, all these folks who are watching me, who expect me to live completely into my word, even if it's the wrong thing to do. And so Herod makes the decision in that moment to take John's life. He cowers in the moment. Found myself thinking this way. It's kind of like where Pilate was with Jesus, isn't it? Pilate was in a similar place with Jesus. This is a foreshadowing of what will happen with Jesus and Pilate, because Pilate will be in the exact same place. There's something about Jesus that Pilate likes. Pilate wants to save Jesus, and yet when it all sort of works itself out or plays itself out, he gives in to the mob. He holds on to, in that moment, he's unwilling to grab hold of the truth, that moment of grace where he could save a man's life. He chooses instead to be held by the mob, the powerful. And he loses sight of his truth, and I think he loses his soul. He loses his soul in that moment. Last week, over the past week and a half, as legislators in South Carolina have been struggling with this question of the flag there in South Carolina. I kept thinking especially as you heard news reports about how some of the legislators who had voted to take down the flag, they knew that would ultimately end their political careers in South Carolina. Do you get that? My family's from South Carolina. I got that. See, it can all look a certain way on the surface, on television, but behind closed doors, I know exactly what they were risking in that vote. Because a lot of folks don't see that flag the same way. They all look at it. There's so many different folks who look at it from different angles, and they see it in different ways. And these legislators are part of that crowd. In that moment, they had to make a choice, a decision. Would they please their constituents, many of them, who were going to hold their political careers in their very hands, or were they going to embrace something that was, or were they going to embrace the truth? That this is a symbol that's keeping us from being together, being united, being in a better place as a state. And these folks, many of them, made a decision in that moment they voted from their souls, and they chose truth over political consequence and power. They stepped out of the mob, if you will. They stepped out of the mob. And I thought to myself, you and I are not going to find ourselves, most of us are not going to find ourselves in those kind of places in our lives. Most of us will never have to stand in that moment like that, like Herod did certainly, or like the legislators in South Carolina did last week. Few of us will stand in that kind of place of decision where it will affect the rest of your life. But it happens every day nonetheless. You and I face similar dilemmas all the time. It happens all the time. I was thinking back to when I was a teenager. I remember in my own family, a local company where one member of the family was white-collar, salaried, and the other was blue-collar, hourly worker. And I just remember the skirmish going on as the folks sort of unionized and as there was a strike in the town. And I remember the tension in the family around these folks. And I remember what really upset the blue-collar member of the family was that the white-collar member of the family would, behind closed doors, tell him he understood. But when we got to the public meeting, he wouldn't stand with him because he had too much to lose. He was in the company. You and I we all know what that means. Come on, let's not kid ourselves. We all know what it means to stand in the company, to stand in this tension. Happens to us all the time. The same thing as when the woman comes into my office. This was years ago. And she says to me, my daughter has come out to us. My daughter is gay. And my husband has basically disowned her. And she'd been living with us for some time. And she said, I can't live with this anymore. And I said, well, what does that mean to you? And she said, well, I love my husband, and I've been trying to stand with him. And it's almost, and you know where the power is in that moment. You know where the power is in that moment. She says, but I am unwilling anymore to give up on my daughter. And so she made a decision. She made a decision years ago to save her relationship with her daughter. And her husband followed. She found the courage to speak truth to power. And her husband, she, in that moment, saved her family. See, we all stand in places every day where we have to be willing to look at, when we look at powerful people or powerful systems, and that doesn't have to be, I'm not talking about great and powerful. Power expresses itself in lots of subtle ways every day, and sometimes it expresses itself in ways that are positive and life-bringing, and at other times it expresses itself in ways that are discriminatory, abusive, and unjust. And isn't it great, by the way, when you see someone who sits in a place of significance in life, in this world? Isn't it wonderful when you see someone like a legislator in South Carolina last week? You see someone sitting in a place of significance, using their power to preserve, to save a life, to redeem a situation. Isn't that wonderful? When you finally see someone who has the courage to act like that, to make a decision that will cost him or her everything, and yet they choose the truth. And I just thought so many examples. The woman who has been a corporate executive and she wants to have a baby, and she's talking about how she's hearing the murmuring from her peers about how it's going to set her back in her career. And I thought to myself, and eventually, by the way, enough of her peers rallied around her and spoke their truth to power. The father who said on the business trip, I'm actually going to cut the business trip short to get back from my son's Little League game, heard the murmurings in the crowd, but would eventually invite conversation within that company around what's important and how to be not just a healthy people, but a healthy company and a more dynamic company. It's amazing what happens when you speak truth to power. You and I tend to laugh at the jokes, though, don't we? We still laugh at the jokes. Whether you're at the club or the office or you're in the neighborhood or you're at church, we still, even laughing at the joke that you shouldn't be laughing at, is caving into power. We do it every day. We compromise ourselves. We compromise our faith. We hold the truth so loosely. And so we find ourselves laughing at the joke, and then we walk away and we realize, why did I laugh at that joke? I was supporting the person telling the joke that diminished another whole group of people. And I came across as affirming in that moment. I laughed with the crowd. I was in the mob. I didn't represent anything that was other, different, or truth. It was all about staying in the crowd, staying in the mob, holding my position, holding my power, holding my privilege. You and I are given opportunities every day. We're not going to have to make a decision Herod had to make probably. We're not going to have to vote like the legislators in South Carolina had to vote last week. But today you're going to have a moment where you're going to make a decision, where you're either going to move with the crowd or you're going to stand for something different and save your soul. And not only save your soul, but represent something of what a healthy soul looks like and what it means to live out of that place in your life. We all know it's true. We all know it's true. And we all know how our world operates, our culture today in this country. We know what's important. We know what's celebrated, which makes it even harder to stand over and against it. It's not easy. It's the conversation you have with your kids and regardless of how old they are, your grandkids, every day trying to encourage them to stand for something different, to be unique, to not go with the crowd, and yet we as parents and grandparents do it all the time. Stand apart, be different, and allow God to use your life in extraordinarily new ways, to not bury others or hurt others, but actually to save another, Amen.